The rain hit the pavement like tiny fists, and time folded into a single frantic rhythm, my feet on wet concrete, my breath scraping like a broken match. His voice, Derek's, coming at me in pieces I couldn't hold together. I didn't think, not really. Thought would have meant turning around. Thought would have meant listening to the reasons he'd used before, the promises that always tasted like ash the morning after. I ran because the only thing sharper than his anger was the memory of how it had felt to be trapped under it. My phone was gone, smashed under my heel in a stumble I would replay forever, and the city blurred into streaks of neon. Shop windows whooped to me in warm rectangles. I pushed my soaked hair from my face and pulled at the collar of my jacket like it could become armor. But the jacket was thin, and the rain kept finding the place where fear sat in me. By the time I saw the leather boutique, I was moving on lungs and impulse. The door was close enough that it felt like destiny, and I shoved it open and into light that smelled of polish and old money. The bell chimed, an absurdly polite sound for the violence I heard fading behind me. Inside, 3 men in black suits and 1 man, calm, dark, unnervingly composed, looked up from a display of jackets as if I hadn't just burst through their door. For a moment, the world held its breath. I had expected a clerk in a name tag. I had not expected them. I stumbled before I could stop myself and landed against the nearest chest, solid as a wall, as if the world had been waiting to catch me. His arms closed around me, not roughly, but with a gathering that made the ground steady again. His coat smelled of tobacco and cedar. His skin was warm and dry beneath my soaking jacket. He held me the way someone holds a glass that might break, careful, inevitable. "You're wet," he said, and the words were ordinary and wrong in that quiet boutique. They somehow made me feel seen in a way Derek's hands never had. He assessed me with a look that didn't ask anything, but took everything. The bruising of my jaw I'd been careful to hide, the tremble behind my knees, the way I only half-breathed as if air itself might be an accusation. Derek's shout cut through the rain outside, sharp, animal, and a boot scraped the threshold. The man who had me in his arms did not flinch. He set me down as if releasing something fragile back into the world, and the men in the shop moved like trained silhouettes. One of them, broad-shouldered, scar along his temple, stepped toward the door. Another reached for something tucked inside his suit like a ritual. "Stay inside," the calm man told me, and his voice was a warm, low thing that settled in my chest like a command I wanted to obey. I wanted to obey because obeying had kept me alive in the past, and I wanted to disobey because obeying had also bound me. The 2 impulses warred behind my ribs, and somewhere between them I found a sliver of stubbornness and answered, I'm not here to cause trouble." He didn't smile. "Good, then don't." Derek's fury carried like thunder, a promise to drag the rain inside the boutique and make it my fault. He tried the door. Locked. He banged. He called my name until it sounded frayed. A bottle clinked somewhere against glass as a hand refused to be steady. I shrank back from the door and watched him through the frosted pane. He looked ridiculous with his soaked hair and his fists, like a man who sized up his life and decided to flatten whatever moved. The man who'd held me looked at Derek through those same glass eyes, and for an instant there was a conversation between them I wasn't invited to hear. It was not much, no words, just angles of shoulders, a tilt of the chin, but it rearranged the air in the room. One of his men returned and spoke softly into a phone, then nodded. Marco, his name came like a small confession from the scarred man, moved without hurry. He opened the door, let the rain breathe in for a second, then closed it again. He didn't wrestle with Derek. He gave him words instead, few, careful, mean, and Derek's face, which had been all battering and demand, slumped into something like stunned calculation. The man who'd caught me by the arm moved so close then that I could hear details: the scrape of his boots on the floor, the metronome of his breathing. His hand brushed my sleeve to peel the soaked fabric back from my skin, and I flinched reflexively away. He didn't snap at me. He didn't touch me again. "What's your name?" he asked, as if it mattered which tiny thing about me would determine how much of him I would get. "Elena," I managed. He repeated it slowly, savoring it like currency. "Elena." It wasn't a vow or a possession then. It was a label that might be kept or discarded. It made something inside me tremble anyway. He introduced himself by way of a dismissal. "You should leave before he gets himself hurt for more than pride." He said it plainly and meant the other part, a warning that his men were not clerks and his patients had reserves I did not know about. I saw what he could do to men like Derek and felt gratitude coiled with terror. Gratitude because someone had stopped the thing that had been hunting me across the city. Terror because the thing I had stumbled into was not simple safety. It had teeth. When he finally spoke my way again, his voice was softer, as if he feared the sound itself might bruise me. "You can stay here tonight. Clothes, dry towel, then I can arrange for somewhere safer, if you want." His offer came like a bridge. It would get me across the canal of what had just happened and into some unknown future. He didn't demand my answer. He said it in the latticed air, like a fact awaiting a choice. I looked at the man in front of me, not at his suit, not at the neatness of his hair, but at how little he flinched at danger, at how violence moved through the space around him like weather. He was a storm wrapped in civility, the kind that made people kneel and call it salvation. I thought of Derek's hands. I thought of the night when I'd stopped feeling like a person and had started feeling like a thing to be arranged. "Should I trust you?" I asked, because trust had become a skill I'd been stripped of. He fixed me with an expression so unreadable it might as well have been carved. "You don't have to," he said. "You only have to stay." There was an odd note in his voice then, a flicker of amusement, maybe, or a calculation. Either way, it felt like the first honest thing he'd offered me. It felt like a lid lifting on a jar and the scent of something very old rushing out. I made a choice. It didn't feel like surrender, though the world would later call it that. It felt like selecting the least terrible route with the smallest footprints. "If I stay," I said, acquiescent and deliberate, "I want a lock on the door and my own room." "Agreed," he said. He offered his arm, and I took it, not because it was the correct thing to do in any moral ledger, but because my legs still shook and his hold steadied the quake. We moved toward the back of the shop where the leather smelt deeper and richer, where jackets hung like armor and the light softened. The men spread out as a quiet, practiced network. Their presence pressed the rest of the world into outline. Before I left, Marco touched the sleeve of his jacket and met my eye. "We don't touch clients," he said in an accented rumble that carried no threat toward me. "But we don't let them be hurt." It was meant to reassure and to instruct all at once. I wanted to believe it. I had to. As we stepped back into the rain, a hand reached for mine, or rather, the man put his hand near mine like a demonstration, and I took it because there was a gravity to his palm I trusted with the trivial faith of someone who'd had too many other supports collapse. He guided me to a car that smelled of leather and lime and something colder: money, decisions, the faint minerals of a long life. The driver, Giovanni, Marco later told me with a nod that came as if he too were making notes, was silent and efficient, as if he had been waiting for this moment as long as the city itself. We drove through streets I knew by the names of lit signs and the angles at which light fell. Derek's silhouette disappeared into the city's bowels like the tail of a comet, and the car took me somewhere I hadn't expected to go. Ethan Moretti's house was not a house so much as a statement, a stone thing with windows like watchtowers and a gate that stopped the rain at a line like a commanded shore. It sat as if carved from the chest of the neighborhood, heavy and immovable and capable of sheltering small, fragile things. They led me inside as if I were a guest and a subject, and the warmth hit me like a hand. Maria, round and ineffably maternal, appeared with a towel and eyes that catalogued me with a single precise scan. Bruises, haunted look, the way I hugged my arms as if to keep me in one piece. Giovanni took my wet jacket with a politeness that felt like ceremony. "You're safe," Maria said, meaning it as a thing you say to a frightened child, but there was a firmness underneath that made the words do the heavy lifting they were meant for. For the first time since the rain started, I let some part of me believe her. They showed me to a room that could have been in a magazine. Quiet fabrics, a bed that swallowed the sound of the world, a window that made the city look like a faraway painting. There was a robe folded on the end of the bed and a note, simple and direct, helpful, not sentimental. Ethan had not signed it with anything other than his name, and the name felt like a promise and a question. There were rules, I learned over the next hour. The house had rhythms and people who kept them. Doors locked from the inside and the outside. Meals were timed. Men moved like currents under the surface of domestic life, doing violent things without blood on the table, keeping a dangerous business from bleeding into the parlor and the china. Marco put a glass of something hot in my hands and sat with his elbows on his knees, a person who watched and listened more than he spoke. "You're safe here," he repeated, because repetition reinforced truth. "If he comes back, he will leave quieter." "Ethan?" I asked, because I had to anchor names to faces. It sounded childish to ask, but this was a new taxonomy of people. "Is that him outside, the one who stopped him?" Marco studied me, then sprawled back against the couch as if to put his belt between me and the idea of danger. "Ethan Moretti is the man who owns a lot of bad things," he said with a wry softness, "and a few good ones, mostly good for those he believes are his." Words like owns might have made me recoil if they had come from anyone else, but Marco said them with an evenness that contained no triumph. It was descriptive, not declarative. It was a warning, and I noticed then, with a small engulfing chill, that everything in this house ran on a different language about possession. Ethan appeared then, not announced, as if the house itself had secret doors only he knew. He moved through the hallway with a patience that had lived many lifetimes. Up close, the details didn't soften. There was a small nick at his brow like a scar that made his face more human. His hands were large, the inside of his wrist freckled, and when he took the rope from my shoulders, he did so as gently as if he were tucking a bird into a nest. "You'll sleep," he said, "then we talk. If you wake in the night, call for Giovanni. If anything happens outside, leave it to us." When he looked at me, the line of sight was heavy with something I didn't name. Ownership, maybe? Or the mapping of a person into his life like a chess piece placed to protect something larger. For a fleeting second, I heard the echo of Derek's claims, the old vocabulary of broken promises. The two voices, Derek's loud, Ethan's low, made a dissonant chord in my head. "I won't be used," I said, because saying it sounded like the last defense I still had. Ethan's mouth, quick and unreadable, twitched. "You won't be," he said, "not while I'm breathing." There was a pledge in the shape of his breath. It made my chest both lighter and heavier. I fell asleep and woke to the house humming with quiet tasks. Someone, a woman with flour-dusted hands, had left toast on the bedside table. The bath was warm and perfumed. Giovanni knocked, a soft, formal sound, and brought tea. The days that followed were small, deliberate things. They let me wear a soft sweater that hid the bruise on my arm, and Giovanni showed me where I could wash my hair properly without feeling watched. Marco taught me how to slip across a room without making a sound, an instruction that was both practical and symbolic. Maria filled the kitchen with soup and stories about the shore where she'd been a girl, as if domesticity could bead itself around me and make a new shore. Ethan made occasional forays into my world, brief, precise visits that left behind small, curated gifts. A book of poetry that smelled faintly of smoke, a fountain pen with a nib too elegant for my scrawl, a leather-bound journal he suggested I keep. "Write what you want," he said once, and then, quieter, because he wasn't a man who wasted tenderness, "keep it for yourself, for when no one else is listening." I did start writing, at first in fits. Small observations, the color of the curtains, the way the rain made the street outside his gate vanish. The journal became a pocket for things I dared not say aloud. It was then, in the unadorned privacy of pages, that I let myself think of what had not been in me for a long time, the possibility of being desired for something other than obedience. Ethan's world showed its edges in strange ways. He kept his phone in a leather case and answered it like a man rehearsing for war. He had a quiet way of pulling people in, making decisions in the air that left risk and delighted enemies alike. One evening, as we sat in the library, a room of books and dark wood and a fire that made the air sweet, he told me, without solicitation, the outline of his family. "We make decisions that keep people alive," he said, simply, as if explaining the weather. "Sometimes those decisions are easy, sometimes they're not." I watched him as he spoke, taking in the ways he softened when memory visited, his hands smoothing the edge of a book, his jaw loosening, and the ways he hardened when necessity stepped in. He did not try to erase his sins. He mentioned them as a man might note scars, with the blunt acceptance of a person who has used the same blade more than once. "Why do you do it?" I asked. It was a childish question, I knew it, but I had nowhere else to put my curiosity. "Because I don't know how not to," he admitted. "Because someone has to decide, and if it's not me, then someone worse will. Because some things, people, are worth the cost." It was not a moral justification. It was an anatomy of his motives. I didn't congratulate him for his ethics. I didn't have to. I was only trying to map the man who had caught me in the rain and kept me from being broken. And yet there were moments, small, almost careless, that revealed the man beneath the myth. Once, watching him examine an old photograph of a woman with a quick, tender sadness, I thought I glimpsed loneliness like a wound. He had a way of looking at me that wasn't the alchemy of power, but something quieter, a hunger for ordinary tenderness he rarely allowed himself. There were fringes, too, the parts of the house that made the truth uncomfortable. A locked room I was told not to enter. A ledger tucked away in the study that Marco once smuggled a look at and then slipped away, face tight. Words were exchanged in low tones in the kitchen that left their echo behind. Threats addressed to names I did not know. Considerations of people and property that suggested the arithmetic of a violent world. I learned by stealth to read the small expressions of the staff. How Maria's smile flattened whenever his name came up. How Giovanni's hands trembled when he thought no one watched. Even in a house built to protect, the cost of that protection was visible. I did not return to the life I had been running from. It wasn't a heroic departure. It was removal, an exit from a map that had once been mine. I watched the city through Ethan's windows and thought of the self I was shedding like a bad coat. I had not decided yet whether I had chosen the right path. I had only moved to the next chapter without the promise of ink. There were nights when I woke to the sound of men in the courtyard, vehicles moving like beasts on the gravel. I slept with the journal across my chest, as if writing could anchor me to a person I could trust. Once, in the long hush before dawn, I heard a whisper outside my door. It was Ethan's voice, low and measured as always, but threaded through with a wearier cadence. "You slept," he said when I opened the door. He was in a sweater that made his shoulders softer. I stayed. "I could go back," I said, though I knew I wouldn't. The idea of returning felt like stepping into soft earth and falling. "You could," he said, "but you won't." There was no anger in his tone, only recognition. Recognition can be kindness. It can also be a line drawn. Days became a pattern of small freedoms and quiet checks. He would sometimes appear at the foot of my bed like a habitual tide, and we would speak for an hour about things that had nothing to do with the outside world, book passages, weather, the taste of coffee. Other times, he would be absent for a week, and I would feel the house contract around me without his breath in the rooms. Words seeped through the underbelly of the neighborhood like damp, and with it came the realization that nothing in the city remained secret. People noticed. Neighbors closed their curtains. News arrived in the form of a woman at the grocery who averted her gaze, and in the catalogs left at the door that contained everything bright and expensive and removed. Once, a courier, young, nervous, left a simple card with a polite note: "If you ever need anything, the Moretti home will help you." It was an odd thing to be shielded and catalogued like an asset. I felt like a plaque in a house museum, admired, preserved, removed from the flow of life. And I began to ask the question that would not leave me: at what point does protection become possession? The first time Ethan said the words aloud, I almost dropped my pen. We were in the conservatory, and light had bled through the glass in late afternoon, kind and almost whole. He had been telling me about the patterns of the city, how people folded into alliances like hands finding one another. "You're mine," he said, casually, as if listing an item from a ledger. The room stopped. The plants, the slow dust motes, everything held its breath. The phrase struck me like a bell in a cathedral, resonant, impossible to ignore. I tasted it. It was iron and salt. My first thought was the reflexive horror of anyone who has been owned by another human. Derek's mantra, "The night says," and the cheapness of control. But Ethan's voice had no sneer. It carried instead a kind of claim that felt both protective and predatory. He didn't say it to scare me. He said it like a fact he intended to maintain. "You don't get to say that," I heard myself answer, stubborn as a child and just as brave. I needed to assert myself. Not like... I stopped because my throat was full. His laugh was small, the kind of sound that came out when someone heard a truth that didn't fit neatly into what they'd planned. "I know," he said, "and you will correct me when I'm wrong." That was the nature of our contract, of the house that sheltered me, possessive language balanced with permission. He would claim, I would correct. There was a dizzyingly odd intimacy in being able to refuse the man who could have given me anything or taken everything. I had access to agency under the roof of a man whose life was made of taking. I spent a morning with Marco in the garage, learning, clumsily, how to check a lock and how to listen to the night. He didn't talk philosophy. He handed me a flashlight like an object lesson. "You learn to hear danger in the quiet," he said, as if danger were a language. He taught me to feel the weight of doors without flinching. And in the cadence of his instructions, there was the first true lesson I'd had in surviving that didn't begin with hiding. "You should learn to fight," he told me once, his voice careful. "Not to go looking for trouble, but to keep your heart from thinking it can be broken with a single hand." There was tenderness in the advice, a fierce, old-fashioned care. It was medicine, not romance. And I started to understand the strange economy of the house, that protection might mean being equipped, not owned. At night, I would write passages that began with the rain and ended in speech I never had the courage to say. I wrote the way survivors do, in fragments that made up whole landscapes if you pieced them together. I wrote about the first time I saw Ethan's hands, about how he tended to small objects like they were lives, about the way his eyes could be a harbor one moment and a storm the next. There were moments of human simplicity that surprised me, the way he would make coffee with a concentration I recognized as ritual, the way his foot unconsciously tapped when he was composing a thought he wasn't yet ready to say. He read to me once, in a voice that smoothed the edges off the day, and for an hour, I believed in the possibility of normalcy. But the city reminded me that normalcy is always on loan. I woke one morning to Marco coming back from a walk, his face a map of quiet trouble. He closed the door behind him and sat without crossing the room for once, which was an unusual lack of ceremony on his part. "What is it?" I asked, because worry was a low tide that made everyone speak. He hesitated, and when he spoke, the words were economical and sharp. "Someone's asking questions," he said. "The Castellanos. They've been smelling around, thinking they might take advantage." The name landed like a stone. Castellanos, a rival family whose reputation was a shorthand for mess and pain. The word brought a cold that had nothing to do with weather. Loyalty in their world was not a neat contract. It was a gauze of obligations, debts, and territorial lines. Ethan arrived then, quiet as ever, and the room constricted a fraction. He listened to Marco and did not appear surprised. Instead, he folded his hands and considered things the way someone considers chess: pieces, moves, possibilities. "They think we're weak because we sheltered you," he said. "They mistake mercy for frailty." "Are they going to act?" "They will test," Ethan said. He looked at me after that, and there was a new calculation in his expression. It was not the gentle platitudes of a man who had taken pity. It was the cold arithmetic of someone arranging defenses. "You should know," he told me. "They will use anything that looks like leverage." Leverage, possession, asset. The vocabulary around me had shifted until everything sounded like commerce. "I don't want to be leverage," I said, my voice thin. It felt like the only sentence I could manage that wasn't a plea. He came closer, and the air between us felt like a line he could have stepped across to take me wholly in. "You won't be," he promised, "not while I'm breathing." The assurance might comfort some. To me, it prickled with paradox. It was shelter, but it came with that thin stitch of ownership. I had traded Derek's abusive cage for a mansion that glittered like a new prison. The difference, in the end, was consent, real, complicated, and slow to arrive. That night, lying awake, I thought about choices. I had made one to come here. I hadn't agreed to anything beyond temporary refuge. Still, I felt the house recalibrating around me, senses sharpened for an enemy that may or may not arrive. There was a hum of purpose in Ethan's people that made the walls feel less like shelter and more like construction. When sleep finally took me, I dreamed of rain again. This time, though, the rain sounded different, less like fists, more like an instrument tuned to a melody I didn't yet know how to play. I woke to a sun that found the dust in the conservatory and turned it into gold. At the breakfast table, Giovanni placed a small envelope in front of me. No flourish, no commentary. Inside was a photograph. Me in the doorway of the boutique, nose bleeding, hair plastered, eyes wide and alive. On the back, in an unfamiliar hand, a single line: "You shouldn't have run." My throat closed. The message was not overt, but it felt like the first ripple of a stone dropped in water. Someone was interested in the fact that I had been somewhere, had been rescued. Someone knew where I was. Names like Castellano started to look less like myths and more like maps. Ethan slid into the seat across from me without a ripple. He didn't comment on the photo. He watched me, as he always watched, gauging, measuring. Then he spoke, without preamble. "They can try to take what they think is valuable," he said, "but there are ways to make something unavailable." Unavailability sounded like a promise and a threat wrapped in velvet. I wanted to ask what that meant. I wanted to ask about consequences and legality and where I fitted into the ledger of his decisions. I wanted, more than anything, to hold tight to the small sense of myself that had not yet been catalogued by his life. Instead, I sipped my coffee and listened, because in this house, listening felt like surviving. The conversation moved with the slow precision of something that had been rehearsed for years. Names were checked off in the air, plans were whispered, not as declarations, but as quiet adjustments. They spoke of alliances and of displays, public pronouncements that could be used to signal strength. The word marriage surfaced like a stone, unexpected and heavy. "It would make you a more ready," Marco said, casually, as if mentioning the weather. "It would make you protected." The sentence sat in the room and didn't melt. I felt it in my veins like a foreign current. "Marriage?" I repeated, because the word had a ridiculousness that made my fear laugh. I pictured a wedding cake in a room where men discussed territory. I pictured vows being used like currency. Ethan met my gaze. For the first time since I'd known him, there was something like vulnerability in his answer. "It removes ambiguity," he said. "It makes your place in our life known, defended. It makes the city understand you're not a loose asset." They framed it as strategy. It was the language of soldiers who wore silk. It was a bargain, safety traded for public claim. My stomach turned. The idea that my body could be a shield for territorial politics was a grotesque kind of utilitarianism. "Do you want that?" I asked, because it was the only honest question. He hesitated, then shook his head gently. "I don't ask for what I want," he said. "I ask for what must be done." That answer, cold, practical, felt like the first margin of a contract. He had not proposed love. He had proposed law. I thought of Derek in the rain, of the smell of his cheap cologne, and the way he used the softness of my hands as a map for his control. I imagined a life signed and sealed in front of other people who could read the contract at a glance and know what that meant. I imagined a public wall that could make the Castellanos think twice. I also imagined binding myself to a man whose house was built on choices that left people broken. Even with Ethan's gentleness, there was the calculus of violence and its consequences. It was a currency with a bloody exchange rate. I slept poorly after that, visions of rings and bright lights, and a future that might be safer, but not fundamentally free. Waking to the sound of rain once more, I realized I had not yet chosen. I had time, and in that time there would be tests of loyalty, of courage, and of what I would allow to happen to me in the name of safety. But the city had already begun to move, and chess pieces were being arranged. I could feel the board pressing against me. When I found Ethan in the conservatory that afternoon, he was reading, and there was a softness in the way the sunlight collected on his hair. He looked up as I entered, and the tilt of his head was an invitation to honesty. I sat opposite him, feeling like a small animal on a table, while huge, older things deliberated around us. "You don't have to decide today," he said, before I could open my mouth. "But you do need to know the truth. If the Castellanos decide to press, they will use anything given." "What if I refuse?" I asked, because for all the safety he'd given, he had not erased the kernel of stubbornness that had kept me running in the first place. "Then we'll find another way," he said. "We'll protect you. It will be messier, riskier, but it will be done." The offer was open-ended and honest. He wasn't trapping me with a promise. He was offering an option with a clear ledger of consequences. That, more than the vow, made me feel seen. Outside, the rain slowed to a drizzle, and the city breathed. I sat there, feeling small and glaring with the force of a person making a choice about the rest of her life. It was terrifying and oddly exhilarating. When I left the conservatory, the air smelled like wet stone and the faint trace of his cologne. He watched me go to my room, and I felt the weight of his gaze like a presence I could not steal away from. That night, I sat at the window and watched the streetlights smear themselves across the wet pavement. Elena, the woman who had run, now sat in a mansion wrapped in protective hands. I had accepted shelter. I had not accepted a binding. Yet. I tore a page out of the journal and wrote in big, decisive letters across the top, "I decide later." Beneath it, smaller, I wrote, "For now, I stay." If you're with me, if the pulse of this story catches at you, subscribe to follow what happens next. I placed the page beneath my pillow like a charm and tried to sleep. The house breathed around me in 100 small noises that used to be calm and had become the music of my new life. Outside, somewhere, men moved in the dark, and the city rearranged itself in relation to me. In the hours before dawn, I woke to the sound of a soft tread in the corridor. I slipped from bed and padded barefoot to the doorway, peering out. Ethan stood at the far window, his silhouette precise against the dim light. He wasn't pretending. He was watching, his hands clasped behind his back like someone willing himself to be steady. He did not turn when he sensed me. He only spoke, and his words were not about strategy, but about something simpler and more terrifying. "Do you trust me?" he asked. The question hung between us like a test and an invitation. I looked at him, at the man who had caught me in the rain, the man whose world had swallowed mine. And I felt in that moment the full weight of the decision waiting for me. It was not about marriage or strategy yet. It was about whether to let the scaffolding of someone else's life become the architecture of my own. I did not answer immediately. I wanted to claim my agency and make a decision out of free will, not survival reflex. I wanted to know whether trust could be rebuilt on the bones of the old betrayals. The silence stretched, and in it the house seemed to lean closer, listening. Finally, I stepped fully into the corridor and joined him by the window. My reflection lay over his, two images merging into one complicated, unpolished future. "I don't know," I said, honestly, "but I'm learning how to choose." He turned then, and for the first time, his features softened without reservation. "Then that's enough for a start," he said. We stood together watching the city as daylight edged toward the horizon, and somewhere beyond the gate, the first tremor of other people's interest began to stir. The first real sign that the city had decided to rearrange itself around me came not with men in the street, but with a letter slid under the door. No flourish, just paper that smelled faintly of smoke and citrus. Inside, a line of neat handwriting. "We handled the man who followed you." No signature. That was the sort of thing you accept or you don't. I tucked the paper into my journal and tried to feel gratitude without letting it flatten into ownership. For days after, the house hummed as if newly awake. Men came and went with faces like weather forecasts, neutral, unreadable, necessary. Marco's shoulders carried less of the theatrical warning they had at first, and more the grim calm of someone whose hands had learned what to do with danger. He was kinder in the way grown men who have seen too much learn to be. He gave me practical lessons rather than speeches. He taught me how to sleep with one ear open and how to keep shoulders relaxed even when your spine wanted to curl into itself. Rumors, however, move faster than any household guard. The Castaños sniffed, Marco's words, and the city's cartilage twitched. Friends of friends wove the story into cocktail chatter, and a business owner on the corner who had always supplied the Moretti house with pastries began delivering extra croissants as if to atone. I began to understand how a name becomes an electric fence. It changed the tone of voices when mine was discussed. It bought me courtesies that had nothing to do with me. It also invited calculations. People who had been neutral suddenly chose sides. Ethan handled the logistics the way he did many things. with a kind of light-handed precision that felt effortless and inevitable. He didn't march around screaming orders. He adjusted the world with small, almost domestic movements. He moved funds where they needed to be, sent messages that arrived as quiet courtesies, made calls that felt like minor inconveniences for those on the receiving end. He explained very little and assumed nothing. When I asked what he'd done about Derek, he did not give me a blow-by-blow. Instead, he brought me violets, simple, well cared for, and left me a note. He won't find you again. I wanted to feel relief so badly I could have cried into those flowers, but the relief came with its own weight. Protection provided by men who spoke in veiled threats implies a ledger. You accept shelter, and you accept that someone has written your name into their books. My gratitude was threaded with calculation. I was safe now, but I had been bought into a system I would never fully understand. The house slid into a strange domesticity. I learned the quiet crafts of living in a defended bubble. Which curtains kept prying eyes blind, the precise moment in the evening when the gates were at their most watchful, which road to use if I wanted to be seen as deliberately out in the world. Maria taught me to fold linens with a care that felt like prayer. Giovanni had the habit of straightening frames when he passed, a talisman against disorder. There was a cadence here that kept fear from erupting. It was a life arranged to minimize tremors. Ethan, meanwhile, continued to be a man whose contradictions lived on his face. He could be maddeningly gentle, bringing me coffee with exacting care, suggesting books that hit a nerve, and then pivot to a hardness that made the back of my neck prick. Once, after dinner, he wandered into the study and closed the door behind him. I sat on the windowsill, the journal on my knees, and listened to the hush of his movements. He spoke softly into the phone. I couldn't make out the words, but I recognized the rhythm of decisions being made. Something practical, something cold. Later, when he joined me in the conservatory, he sat as if the conversation had been about weather rather than threats. "They tested last week," he said. "Not a question, but a ledger entry. Someone made a push. They were stopped." "Stopped how?" I asked, because curious is a word that beats in my chest in rhythm with survival. His eyes shaded. "In ways you won't need to know. That would only be terrifying," I supplied. He smiled, the briefest curve that suggested he agreed. Necessary. I had to remind myself often that he was not a savior in a narrative where good triumphs without cost. He was a man who did things because he believed the world required them of him. The consequences of his choices floated through the house like the smell of smoke after a distant engine. Present, unsettling, but not detailed. The Castaños didn't simply bluster. They sent messages in a kind of theater designed to rattle. A car I recognized by make and customizations idled just beyond the gate one night, its headlights like gazes. A piece of graffiti appeared 2 blocks away, a crude symbol I didn't immediately understand and later learned was a mark of theirs. One evening, a man I had never seen before came to the gate wearing an expression of polite business. He left a wrapper of a candy no one in the house ate with a note, "We admire boldness." Ethan handled these not with brute force, but with public posture. He wrote checks where they would be seen and sponsored a local music hall's production that earned him quiet plaudits. He made visits to civic dinners where he stood like a fixture, dignified and unassailable. If he wanted to send a message, he sometimes did it in the plainest public way, presence dressed as civility. It unnerved me to watch power behave like manners. One afternoon, Marco took me into the city with him under pretense of errands. He let me walk the market for an hour, among stalls of citrus and fabric and the human churn of a place that lived outside the boundaries of our safety. It was a test, I think, and a gift, to move without the house as a buffer and measure the world that had existed before Ethan claimed any part of me. People looked at me differently, curious, careful, respectful. Here I was not a protected asset. I was a woman walking through a marketplace with a bag of oranges and an entirely personal purpose. By the time we returned, my legs felt restored. Marco handed me a small parcel, A ring box the size of a matchbook. I nearly laughed. "What's this?" I asked. He watched me, an expression that briefly misplaced the usual impassivity. "He asked me to give it to you if it ever seemed like you might need a choice," Marco said. I opened it with a careful finger. Inside was a simple band, thin gold, not gaudy, worn as if meant to be practical and not theatrical. For a moment I thought he offered it as a talisman of ownership, but Marco's eyes were steady on mine, and there was no gloating in them. "Not for him," he said, "for you." I closed the box and tucked it into my pocket like an ember. Weeks folded into a tense routine of small domesticities and long, low-level anxieties. I wrote more and began to send fragments of my journal out into the world, anonymous pieces to a women's forum, small truths masked as fiction. Sharing felt like ventilating the house. It is astonishing what feels like courage once the first tremor of danger recedes. Then, on a day when the sky lay thin and the city smelled of rain, the matter that had been arranging itself in the margins finally came to me in concrete terms. Ethan found me in the library with my journal open and a pen stalled at a sentence that wouldn't find its ending. He sat opposite, watching the rhythm of my writing like a spectator at an intimate concert. "I want to propose something," he said. My skin tightened automatically. Proposals meant decisions. I had learned to treat them like small earthquakes and look for aftershocks. He didn't go the romantic route. There were no knees bent, no careful speech about future happiness. Instead, he laid out a case like a lawyer preparing an essential clause. The city had started to speak about me as a thing of territorial value. The Castellanos would test boundaries. A public claim would make my position clear. Marriage, he said plainly, converted a private refuge into a public fact. It would place you under the Moretti name, he explained. It would make you untouchable in the usual ways, because the city knows what a Moretti match demands. Untouchable, I echoed, and the word felt at once attractive and obscene. The idea of being protected from being hunted had an undeniable appeal. But the idea of being declared someone else's property, even ceremonially, even publicly, was an echo of everything I'd run from. He paused, his hands folded. "I won't make this decision for you." "Is this a choice at all?" I asked. "If I refuse, what happens?" "We find another way," he said. "It will be more dangerous. We can do it, but the risk will be on you, on us." That last sentence, tender rationality with a hard edge, was the thing that made me understand the whole horror and the whole possibility of the offer. To accept was to trade a kind of liberty for a different kind of safety. To refuse was to insist on a freedom that might be paid for with repeated violence. Either road had casualties, though of different kinds. I went home that night and paced the way you might pace a room to shake loose an answer. I pulled the thin gold band from my pocket and rolled it between my fingers. I kept thinking of Derek in the rain, how what he wanted was not me, but the satisfaction of crossing me into possession. I kept thinking, too, of the man at the boutique who had caught me mid-sob and steadied me as if I were something very fragile he couldn't bear to see broken. They were not the same man, but they were two responses to the same cruel world. One used claim as a weapon, the other used it as shield. Where did one end and the other begin? I spoke with Maria that evening, her voice like warm sugar. She listened more than advised, but when she finally spoke, it was with the blunt love of someone who had fed more than a household in her long life. "If you marry him," she said, "you will join a house. You will have food and shelter and a name people understand. You will also give up a shape of freedom you had, because every house asks for something. I think you know what you are willing to give." I did know, in the way my body knew how to assess a room or a person. There were rooms of the world I could walk into now without men following me. There were mornings I slept without nightmares. There was a man who, in private, brushed my hair with a gentleness that had nothing to do with leverage. But there were nights I woke with the taste of blood in my mouth and the urge to run. When I told Ethan I wanted time, real time, not the polite delay he had allowed, he agreed with a small nod. "Decide when you have to," he said, "not a day sooner." That answer felt like a kind of mercy. He did not force me to make a decision in the heat of fear. He let me sleep on it, let me weigh the ledger. It was the first time I had felt the texture of breathing where fear had once held me in a chokehold. And then the world decided for me, in a fashion. A provocateur from the Castellanos made a misstep at a party near the waterfront. They touched one of Ethan's businesses, a small, public affront meant to goad. Ethan responded not with blood in the streets, but with a gala. Not the theatrical gala you see in magazines. This was a carefully curated public evening that doubled as a show of solidity. It was an assertion of normalcy and intent. It would be a night for the city to watch and for alliances to be declared. It was the exact sort of chess move they discussed in the library. The invitation arrived in the form of a thick card. I stared at it for a long time. Attendance at the gala would be causal proof of my presence in his orbit. It would put me in public beside him. It was an opportunity, and it was a risk. "Do you have to go?" I asked him the evening he placed the invitation on the table between us. He looked at me with the patience of someone who had lived through many uncomfortable choices. "Yes," he said, "and I want you there, not as an accessory, as someone who stands with me of her own accord." His phrase, "someone who stands with me of her own accord," was both promise and test. He wanted me beside him, but not only because marriage would be a strategic move. He wanted, if truth be told, that the claim be something more than a signed contract. He wanted me to be a presence who could choose. I spent the week leading to the gala oscillating between rehearsing what it might mean to say yes publicly and rehearsing 1,000 refusals in the safety of my journal. Marco trained me in posture. Maria taught me how to accept a compliment without flinching. Giovanni fitted dresses until one hung on me like it had always belonged to my shoulders. Ethan, when he came by, offered quiet corrections, a tilt of a chin, a smoothing of a sleeve. There was intimacy in these touches, domesticity braided into the public work. It unsettled me and steadied me at once. The night of the gala was a braid of nerves. The city glittered as if money could bend light itself. Arriving in a car that smelled of new leather felt surreal. I stepped from the vehicle into the flash and the hum, the cameras, the whispered commentary, the hidden cameras that made the city feel like a stage. The Moretti presence was impeccable. Allies in tails and gowns like dark oaks, staff moving like practiced instruments. Ethan's arm found mine in a way that felt practiced and unspoken, a connection that communicated, without words, that I was with him by choice. He wore the sort of expression he reserved for public negotiations, patient, composed, impenetrable. He smiled at acquaintances with the trained warmth of someone who always measured the angle of a grin. We moved through the crowd like two figures in a painting. The Castaños, predictably, were present. Teresa with her meticulous jewelry, Vincent with a politeness that had teeth. There was a moment, as often happens, when proximity becomes a conversation without words. Eyes met. A challenge was registered. It was all choreographed, and my heart raced like an instrument that could either be tuned or broken by the next note. Then Ethan did something I hadn't expected. He stopped at the center of the room, in view of cameras and city elites, and put his hand on my waist. He spoke into the hush like a man making a ledger entry in ink that would not smudge. "Elena Moretti," he said, and the name fell like a bell. People turned. The air shifted as if someone had opened a window and let a cold wind declare its presence. "Will you stand with me?" It was not a proposal in the tender sense. It was an official declaration, a public placing. My pulse felt loud in my ears, but under that noise there was a strange calm. This was the moment the city's calculus would interpret. If I stood with him willingly, it would become harder to use my vulnerability as leverage. I could have said no. I could have walked away down the steps into a world that might have come back to hunt me. My hands had trembled in rehearsal. Now they felt steady as stone. Yes, I said, choosing the word like a tool. The room held its breath and then released into a polite applause that felt like a soundproofing. It was not melodrama. It was a piece of strategy completed. The Castellanos looked at each other. For an instant, I saw calculation like cracked glass over their faces. Then Vincent smiled, the coldest of smiles, and bowed slightly. The crowd interpreted the scene and filed it away. Elena Moretti was not a stray lamb. She was allied. Later, in the privacy of the car, Ethan's hand found mine and squeezed, a small human pressure that said without rhetoric what words could not. "Thank you," he murmured. He could have thanked me for joining the family, for helping the strategy, but I felt instead that he was thanking me for recognizing him in the full, awkward bargain he was offering. There were consequences, of course. The streets might have been quieter that night, but in the following week, a series of skirmishes, minor, veiled, revealed that the Castellanos had not retreated entirely. A window at a rival business was cracked. A courier delivered an unflattering op-ed about Moretti philanthropy. But the tone had shifted. The city's predators recalibrated. Public claims, I learned, could be a kind of armor. We did not rush into marriage. There were preparations, legalities that someone in his world made to be more than ceremonial. There were conversations about the appearance of consent and the reality of commitment. We argued about how public we would be, and I insisted on speaking at least once during the ceremony. I wanted my voice to be audible, not just my image. The planning was a montage of odd tenderness. Maria fussed over the guest list like she was arranging a feast meant to knit the world together. Marco negotiated security with a surgeon's calm. Giovanni looked at me with honest pride when I practiced my vows in the morning light, making no attempt to hide how the soft woman I had been in the market had become someone many would notice. Ethan walked through arrangements with precise taste, nothing ostentatious that would imply celebration of violence, nothing that would glamorize what we were legally, publicly undertaking. The wedding, when it came, was a small, formal ceremony in the garden behind the mansion. It was not gilded, not media bombastic. It was chosen that way because Ethan preferred the quiet that makes a public statement without screaming it. There were people present who made the city's map readable, friends, allies, few of the Moretti elders. And in private, it was still us. Ethan reading in the small hours, me writing my fragments and sometimes reading them aloud to him. We argued out things that had nothing to do with territories, whether the curtains should be a shade lighter, the way to hang a painting. These arguments, oddly domestic, made him more than his myth. Of all the adjustments, perhaps the most unexpected was how isolation dissolved into something like companionship. He was not affectionate in syrupy ways. Instead, his tenderness emerged as attentiveness. He remembered the way I liked my coffee. He kept a light burning in the study for when I wrote late. He would sometimes place a hand at the small of my back in the library, as if to say, silently, "I'm here." His softness did not cancel the reality of his power, but it made our mutual life complex in a human way. Months slid on. The city learned to live with us. The Castellanos made a few more noises, the occasional business obstruction, a smear campaign, but the most violent of the threats had been blunted by clear public claim and a system of deterrence Ethan had cultivated. There were costs, of course. People who had once been neutral now made decisions that had consequences. I tried not to become numb to that. And then, in an ordinary morning that smelled of toast and rain, I realized my body had shifted. The morning sickness came as a dull hum that shifted my appetite. A test, an act of private hope, revealed what the rest of the house felt like a slow-moving chorus, positive. I sat with the tiny plastic stick and laughed once, a sound that was part disbelief, part joy, part fear. When I told Ethan, he was working in the study. He looked up when I entered, and the way his face opened was almost a child's, unrehearsed, intimate, disbelieving, and glad. He came to me and gathered me into his arms with a gentleness that was unshowy but full of something like wonder. "Is it," he began, and the rest of the questions seemed to dissolve at that hush. He didn't march out to make grand plans. He simply held me and asked quietly, "Is this what you want?" I thought of the life I'd chosen, the trade-offs, the shelter, the small freedoms, and then I pictured a child with my eyes and his hands. I saw a future I hadn't had permission to imagine before this house. It was not an easy image. There were calculations about safety and legacy and the messy arithmetic of being born into a house like this. But there was also a raw human yearning I had spent years denying to be prudent. I leaned into him and said yes. We told Maria and Giovanni in the soft way of families, over soup and with hands pressed in comfort. Marco, who never showed too much in the way of feeling, donned a face that was close to tender. The house seemed to breathe out. For a while, the world arranged itself around the small, growing promise of a new life. The pregnancy changed the tenor of everything. It made public attention more complicated. It made some of Ethan's decisions more urgent. He became more protective, not in a possessive, performative way, but in the practical rhythms of ensuring hospitals and doctors, of checking the routes to clinics, and making sure the staff were trusted. He was precise in how he managed the risk, full of a quiet diligence I had not often expected to see. I had moments of panic, imagining scenarios where our child might be a pawn in someone else's calculus. And Ethan addressed them not with empty assurances, but with concrete actions. He tendered legal protections, he distanced things that could be dangerous. He accepted that some parts of our life could not be fully controlled and did not pretend otherwise. As my body grew, the world softened and sharpened at once. I found my voice in new ways. I refused interviews that felt exploitative. I wrote more, sending essays out under my own name about survival and choice and the oddities of being claimed yet choosing to stay. People read my words and sometimes wrote back with stories of their own survival. The life of a woman who had been on the run, shifting into a mother-to-be in a house of power, felt like a paradox, but it was mine. We did not pretend the costs were small. There were nights Ethan would not sleep, and once or twice men who had been part of his network questioned whether the cost of our protection might be too high for the price. Rumors still circled in the underbellies of bars. There were moral questions I could not, in good conscience, answer. Had I made a bargain with a system that perpetuated violence? Perhaps. Was my child safe? For now, yes. Would that always be true? I could not know. We lived with those unknowns like furniture in a room, present and navigable. The day I first felt the baby kick, it was as if the whole house inhaled. Ethan, who was making tea, froze and set the cup down. He placed his hand gently on my belly, and we sat together, listening in that intimate way that people who are forging a life learn to do. The kick was small and then another, like punctuation. It shattered something in me that had been held tight by fear and left in its place a fierce, protective tenderness I had not known I could carry. At night, in bed, I would put my hand on the small swell and catch his hand covering mine. We would not always speak. Sometimes we simply held the cadence of breathing. Once I asked him, "Do you ever imagine a different life, one where we didn't have to do the things we did?" He considered the ceiling, then my hand, then the dark. "I imagine many things," he said, "but I accept what we have. I accept the choices we've made because I think there was, at least, an intent to protect something worth keeping." "Is that enough?" I asked. "It's the most we have," he replied, "and sometimes we make it more." I took those words as both truth and a challenge. Months passed. The city moved around its machinery. The Castellanos, faced with a married woman bearing the Moretti name, retreated into new maneuvers. There were still skirmishes, small and inconvenient, and sometimes cruel in their indirectness, but the most dangerous edges cooled. My life was not free of moral complexity. There were nights I quarreled with Ethan about how much transparency we owed the public, about how his company's philanthropy could be used to buy influence, and about whether we could ever ensure our child would not inherit the heavy footprint of our choices. We argued with honesty, something I cherished, and our fights were not about the heat of resentment, but about how to hold the shape of our lives together. When the baby arrived, it was a night streaked in rawness and calm. Maria was a steady presence, a being of recipes and patience. Giovanni was more anxious than his careful exterior usually allowed. Marco slept nearby like a sentinel. Ethan was there with hands that trembled in ways his face did not show. His voice was low and precise. The child, a girl with a shock of hair and fingers that clutched like a tiny knot, came into my arms, and I felt the ferocity of love as if it were a physical thing. They named her after my grandmother, an act that felt like a small defiance against all the things that had tried to erase the past. Ethan stood beside me as a partner and as a man bearing the cost of his decisions. He looked at our daughter, and I sensed a softness so deep it made him human in a way the world sometimes forgot. In the weeks after, the house transformed into something closer to a home than a fortress. There were visitors who brought toys and stew, allies who pledged protection in the muted language of favors and obligations. There were also quieter moments, Ethan kneeling on the floor to coax a coughing fit through with a gentle cloth. Me writing in the margins of my journal about the small, ordinary miracles of waking to a child's breath. I will not pretend it was utopia. There were still threats, still reputations to manage, still moral costs that I lived with and sometimes did not sleep over. There were friends who could never fully reconcile the man Ethan was with the tenderness he had learned to give me. There were nights when I sat up and imagined outcomes that made the back of my neck cold. But there were also nights I slept with a hand on my daughter's tiny chest and felt in that small rhythm the answer to many of my earlier questions. One afternoon, when the rain came soft as a confession, I stood by the window and watched water lace the pavement. My reflection overlapped Ethan's in the glass, two figures carrying a child between them in the architecture of a life forged from necessity and choice. The rain sounded different now, not a fist but an instrument, tuned to a tune I had learned to play. He appeared behind me and without a word placed his hand over mine. He had said those words once, "You're mine," in the conservatory months before, and I'd answered him then with a correction of the grammar of ownership. Now, with a life between us that neither of us could fully claim alone, his voice when he spoke was softer, complicated, and true. "You're mine," he said again, with no intent to own, but with the humility of someone who recognizes shared custodianship. This time, I didn't flinch. I corrected him, as I had in the beginning. "I'm Elena," I reminded him, "and I'm yours by choice." He smiled. "I know." We let the rain map the world, two figures held between the city's rough hands and the slow building of a home. Outside, somewhere, rival families rearranged their pieces. Inside, a woman who had once run through rain and hidden in a boutique had found a strange, precarious sanctuary. I had not been rescued into a fairy tale. I had been offered a life that required ongoing negotiation, a life where protection and possession blurred and needed constant naming. And yet, by the time a child's breath warmed the nights and the jacket on Ethan's shoulder softened at the edges with use, I could say, without romance or simplification, that I had been chosen and I had chosen back. If you followed Elena's story this far, there's more to come. Watch the next chapter in the description to see how the world rearranges itself around lives that choose to stay.